All right, welcome everybody. I think we are going to go ahead and get started. We have a few people who are still joining, but we can go ahead and get going with this. My name is Amy Galatly. I'm one of the housing attorney supervisors here at Bread for the City. And I'm so excited to welcome you all for being here with our Breaking Bread session about housing justice. I have the pleasure of moderating the event, and there's going to be 4 panelists speaking on this important topic: Leonard Edwards and Robin Dudley, who are also Bread for the City colleagues, as well as Danielle Burrs joining us from DC Appleseed Center for Law and Justice, and the amazing Janice Lewis-George, DC Council member representing Ward 4. So each of these panelists has really a lifetime of amazing work and accomplishments. So I'll let you study their bios later at your leisure, but I will just ask each panelist to give a sentence or two to introduce themselves before they give their first remarks. Before we get into that, I do want to sort of set the stage a little bit, because we're here to talk about housing justice in the context of these eviction moratoriums that are ending all over the country. I know that if folks have been paying attention to the national news or to housing rights related news, you may very well have heard that the eviction moratorium is over. And so we just want to start by giving a little bit of context around what that means here in DC, because there's actually several eviction moratoriums or moratoria that have affected tenants' rights in the District of Columbia. And that's what we in this conversation are really going to be focusing on, because that's who we serve. That's the community we work with. So the big national news was that the CDC moratorium was struck down by the Supreme Court back in August. Kind of luckily for us, that didn't really matter too much here in DC, because the federal moratorium, the CDC moratorium, was really just a floor that was providing some level of protections for some tenants across the country. But here in DC, for the 19 months of the pandemic, we have had many more protections in place, thanks in part to our hardworking council members and to the hardworking housing advocates and tenants all over the district who push those council members to do the right thing. So in addition to the federal or the CDC moratorium, we had a couple other blanket moratoriums basically that prevented DC landlords from evicting DC tenants, and even from taking the initial steps that end up leading to an eviction, such as filing an eviction case or sending a notice to a tenant that they were going to file an eviction case. All of that has been on hold, and really just yesterday, some eviction cases were allowed to resume being filed. So we are really now feeling what the rest of the country is feeling, which is that the protections that were in place have been stripped away, and there are quite a lot of concerns about what this is going to mean for tenants, particularly low-income tenants, such as the people that Bread for the City serves. We know so far that there's been over 500 evictions scheduled just for these first few months, and there will probably be thousands more eviction cases filed in coming weeks. So we're very glad that you all are here to have this conversation with us, to hear a little bit about how we got to this point. What does this really mean, and what can we do about it so that we can protect against the injustices of housing insecurity and homelessness and everything that comes along with that. So I'm going to ask my first question to Danielle, and just a reminder, Danielle, if you would start by saying just a sentence or two about yourself, and then can you fill in the historical landscape for us a little bit about how we got to this moment where housing is simply unaffordable for so many of our residents here in the District of Columbia?
Sure, it's a great question. So I'm Danielle Burrs. I'm counsel at DC Appleseed, which is a think and do tank is what we like to call ourselves. We work on a variety of public policy issues, including affordable housing, which is near and dear to my heart, and really most of my background working here in DC in public policy. So it's a big question that Amy just asked. And I think the most important thing to say is this is a structural issue. It's not an accident or a force of nature. So we can talk about some of the structural reasons that we got to where we are, where housing is unaffordable for so many people, particularly in DC. So going back quite a bit, but not to the very beginning, there were many enslaved and free Black workers who built the District of Columbia. And at the time, there was no requirement that where they lived meet certain standards. So you could have all kinds of buildings and people could be technically inside, but maybe not safe, maybe not healthy. Very similar to when we think about tenements. People usually think about New York, but the more regulations that were put on top of housing, the more barriers there were to get permission to build, to create housing, in addition to additional cost, which in some ways is good. We want people to be safe and to be healthy. But that also can lead to people choosing to zone certain areas a certain way. So then we get to redlining, where certain groups of non-white people were not allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods that folks were excluded from got the most investment. Those areas where folks went as not their first choice got the least investment. And that way, in addition to other barriers to gaining wealth, the property that folks of color, particularly Black people, were able to gain access to could be more expensive because they had fewer options and fewer options for financing. And it was considered less valuable. And still today, a lot of homes are considered less valuable if they're in certain neighborhoods that correlate with a high rate of non-white families. So a lack of, or much less generational wealth makes it much more difficult, both to purchase a home, but also to just pass that money on to your family so that they can afford certain things, including even rental housing, or having a place to crash. You know, if grandma owns a house and things go south, maybe you can stay with grandma. If she doesn't, maybe you can't. Please tell me when I'm going over time, but I'm getting there. So, you know, there are a lot of interventions, such as federally funded public housing, which, you know, at certain times could be really heavy-handed and not take into account the context. So in DC, we have the Southwest neighborhood, where, you know, entire neighborhoods were wiped out in place of what was meant to be long-term, healthy, safe, affordable housing that was not invested in as much as it needed to be long-term, which turned out to be the case pretty much across federally funded public housing. Has been disinvested in year after year. So, you know, then your options are bad. Your resources as a neighborhood are limited. Your resources as an individual are limited, and you have costs that are additional. So maybe you live farther away from your place of work, so you have to get a car, even though you really can't afford that. Or, you know, folks who live in Park Morton sometimes have invested in a dehumidifier or something else to deal with mold in the building that really shouldn't be a cost to them when they can't afford it. So, you know, you start out behind, and then there are additional barriers that keep you behind.
So we are about at time. I don't know if a final sentence or two to sort of bring us up to like the trends of the last decade or so with skyrocketing rents and displacement.
Absolutely, thank you for that. So kind of fast forwarding and touching lightly, there was, you know, huge disinvestment from cities in general in the 90s, including specifically in DC, and property values went way down. And then people coming back in have invested in a lot of neighborhoods, not equally across neighborhoods, but folks with a lot more money have increased demand for the housing in DC. So as we have increased the professional workforce, and the professional workforce has chosen more and more to live in the city instead of just outside the city. That's driven up cost as well. So, you know, the huge swing from the 90s where there was huge disinvestment to currently where there is so much more money in the housing market from folks who are coming in from other places. And I'll say, you know, I wasn't born in DC, so I own that. But yeah, it just makes the competition really fierce for a limited resource.
Okay.
I didn't mention the Height Act. That's the other thing. We can only build so high, which makes the cost efficiency of building in DC really limited. But I will stop. I hope I got to some of the things you were hoping I would get to.
Thank you for trying to pack, you know, hundreds of years of history into a very short answer. That's really helpful framing. So my next question is for Robin. And as with Danielle, if you could start by giving a sentence or two introduction to who you are. But the question is, over the course of this pandemic, we've heard a lot of reasons about why we needed an eviction moratorium, why it was actually in our collective best interest as a society. So given sort of some of the history that Danielle described, is there still a case to be made for having an eviction moratorium at this point?
Hello, everyone. My name is Robin Dudley. I am the representative payee supervisor here at Bread for the City. We help with a contract from the DC government, work with consumers who are mentally ill. We manage their money so that their case managers can work on their mental health and them being the best person that they can be. So it's a joint partnership. And about 20 years ago, they decided to separate the two, and Bread for the City ended up being the payee program. And so, Amy, to answer your question, there was a need for eviction moratorium, number one, because we were faced with a crisis, a pandemic that none of us nor our parents had ever seen nor lived through. Living through this last year and a half, number one, we're still in a pandemic. Job numbers, we see it every single day. Job numbers are just not where they need to be, which means that people are still unemployed. And so they're not having money to pay rent. They're still unemployed. There's still unstable childcare. So I'll just sum that all up, that we're still in a pandemic. And some of the people who suffered the worst are the ones that have the longer road to recovery. And so one of the benefits of the eviction moratorium was most of the landlords in this city applied for the federal funding and were granted. They had the ability, they had the resources, they had the legal team to get that money up very early, where, you know, people who are at home, we were lost. We didn't know what to do. Thankfully, I work for an organization that was able to keep our employment, not interrupt our pay, but it didn't take away the fact that families lost heads of households. Families lost, you know, children were home 24/7. Every cost went up. Let's not talk about the mental part of it. People were home watching TV. They were, you know, if you're fearful and you don't know what's coming next, sometimes you do the unthinkable. And so Amazon all over our TV, people were finding things to do because they didn't know what was coming next, or, you know, and I do not, and so I say this, all of this to say, yes, it was necessary. I say, yes, it is still necessary. We do know that with Stay DC, there's things in place where the landlord has to apply before you can start an eviction process with a tenant, that the landlord has to apply for the Stay DC. So I think that's very helpful. I think Stay DC definitely has removed some of the barriers for people, because I actually, in the very beginning, when they introduced the application, I went on just to see what the barriers were. And there were barriers. And so people who do not have resources already, don't have computers, don't have that made it even harder. And it wasn't until months later where they say, we still have $300 million that, and so where we are now, I think we're in a fair place. But I also think that this pandemic is not over, and there's still so much unemployment. There's still so much uncertainty. There's still so much, with the vaccine mandates, employers trying to maintain people who've made the choice not to get vaccinated. And then that being a part of that, no. And so people having to make the decision, do I want to get vaccinated, something that, whatever the reason is, or go back to work because I have to feed my family. People are having to make really hard decisions. And so I appreciate the fact that they're working with tenants, they're working with landlords. I think that was the biggest part, for the landlords to be able to submit applications as well. And so my hope is that cut down on, a whole lot of the evictions.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that answer. I think, one thing that has struck me is that we heard throughout the course of the pandemic, if people are sick with a contagious disease, they should be housed, and that's something we've been saying at Bread for the City for decades. If people have needs, they should be housed, right? It's harmful for people in vulnerable situations to be unhoused. And it's harmful for the rest of us to be living in a society where people's basic needs aren't met. So I'm just so proud to be part of Bread for the City, where we've had that vision all along. And we know that it's not just over just because, restaurants are open again, as Robin so clearly pointed out. First of all, this thing isn't even over yet. Thank you. I want to put my next question to Leonard. Leonard, how do you feel about the ending of the eviction moratorium, and what have you been hearing from other DC residents? And if you could start with a sentence or two introducing yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Amy. My name is Leonard Edwards. I first came to Bread for the City in 2002 as a volunteer, and then I needed Bread for the City's help with just about everything, so I became a client. I became a client leader. I sit on the board, Bread for the City's Board of Directors, as a client member, and I was an initial member of Bread for the City's Client Advisory Council. And now, thank God and thank the Bread, I am working part-time in Bread for the City's Housing Advocacy Department. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I live in Ward 4, and to answer or try to answer or add to your answer, Amy, how do I feel about ending the moratorium? The moratorium should not be ended, not at all, because for one, the pandemic isn't over. And, I'm reading in certain places where, there's going to be a new variant that's going to pop up here in a little while because we can't get the herd immunity. You have kids in school, and you know how kids are, they touch everything, they cough in each other's face. And plus you have the flu season coming up, cold weather coming up. So the moratorium should definitely not be, over. It needs to be extended. And for one, and for another reason, the Stay DC application was very arduous. It was difficult. I mean, you had.
Let me just interrupt you, if I may, to make sure that I'm not sure all of our participants know what Stay DC is. So,
okay.
Stay DC is a DC program that's funded by the federal government to provide rental assistance for people who fell behind in rent during the pandemic. So I just wanted to give that little overview.
Thank you. We've been talking about the digital divide for over a decade. And then they have this very arduous application to get, this emergency rental assistance and, desperate assistance for people. And, you know, they made it, I felt they did it on purpose. They made it very hard. I mean, you got to download this and upload that. And, you know, it was very hard. And a lot of people, first of all, don't have the internet. You know, a lot of people don't have laptops and notepads and things like that. And then a lot of people just don't know how to use the internet and move around on these applications. They could have done a better job with this application. I feel that they didn't really want people to get the money. And then for one, our Hispanic community, you have a you know, language gap there. You know, they're afraid to answer these questions because of fear of, you know, many different things. And the moratorium shouldn't be over. It needs to be extended. One other reason I put down, that was it. Your second question, what are you hearing from other DC residents?
In a too.
Yeah, what, you know, they're like me. They don't feel the moratorium should end. I mean, they're still in really crisis situations. And like I said, especially with our Hispanic community, a lot of work that they do is so-called essential workers. And, you know, they go out and they're susceptible to, you know, catching COVID. They live in closed area, 1-2 bedrooms. You know, you're bringing stuff back to the kids coming home from school, bringing stuff back to the parents. I mean, come on, they just closed down several schools. They had to go back virtual because 40% or something like that of the students had caught COVID. You know, it's just common sense. It's just really common sense. It's not that hard. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know, especially with winter coming, that you know, people are afraid. People are afraid to get evicted, and they really need more time and get help to fill out the state DC applications to get the rental assistance.
Thank you so much for that answer. I want to turn next to the council member. A little framing for this question. There was a report that came out last year that showed that DC landlords filed about 32,000 eviction cases against DC residents every year, which affects about 1 in 9 DC renters every year, and 1 in 4 DC renters in Ward 7 and 8, which, if anyone listening is not familiar with the DC area, Wards 7 and 8 are the districts in DC that are east of the Anacostia River, and those are the districts with the highest proportion of Black residents. So my question to you, council member, is why does this matter, this high rate of evictions?
Well, you know, I think, you know, it matters because housing is dignity. I think it matters. And so we shouldn't, we have to end homelessness, especially chronic homelessness. It matters because housing is community pride and stability. You know, housing is healthcare, literally. It saves lives. You know, when quarantining at home, shelter in place was so important to reducing community spread over COVID. It can't be even any clearer, I don't think. It should have been clear before that housing is healthcare. And at the fundamental place, housing is a human right. And we need programs to work for residents to bring more actual affordability to those who are most cost burdened. You know, racial disparity and systematic poverty is entrenched deep in the district. And so these aren't just, and when we give numbers sometimes, you know, people don't recognize that when we keep talking about these numbers, we're talking about human lives. And how that has played out over the last couple of years. You know, I just had a meeting with DC Action, and they just talked about the 30 years of divestment in kids, and the same, it goes for housing. And so, you know, for far too long, you know, the system has really been built for landlords. and not to protect tenants and to not view housing as all of the things that it is and represents. And that's real. And I think, one of the tragic realities of this pandemic is how unequal it has been. People doing well who were stable pre-pandemic before, largely fared okay, and we were able and do that. But those struggling before fell even farther behind because of job loss or new types of childcare / learn from home responsibilities or medical debt, something we don't talk about, or other hardships. And so, I want to say that, I want and continue to want the moratorium to be extended further. Unfortunately, the votes weren't there for this summer. We're not there this summer to go further than the current phase out plan. So we had to do a lot of hope riding on Stay DC to mitigate this disaster. But even with improvement, it's still not working well enough. I mean, we know, Stay DC got off to a slow start, and we know issues will still persist. The program is paying out rents now and helping tenants get current to avoid evictions, but I'm still concerned about people filled out applications over the summer, but then spent months waiting for determinations. So they are behind again now. We still have people who don't know about Stay DC, and we need to get them processed as soon as possible. So funds don't run out. The event just happened in my ward, and Empower DC did at the church, and individuals still didn't know about it. There's folks who are still stuck in limbo in the review process and not hearing proactively or timely enough from say about issues with their applications. And, some folks are not used to using email, maybe missing in communications from the program. And tenants may not have landlord email, or emails on applications, don't match exactly. So the landlord tenant side up match process has really been complex and drawn out. I think Leonard spoke to it. There's been language and documentation and general technology barriers, which still remain. It's some reports from constituent of Stay only paying. I have some reports from constituents saying Stay DC is only paying partial amounts of their arrears. I.e., both tenant and landlord request higher amounts than they're actually paid. And so, it's not enough proactive outreach and assistance at buildings and neighborhoods where there are high levels of lower income residents and residents likely to have lost work. And so, I think it's important. I know that, yesterday began the day in the part of the phase out, and I'm already getting calls, and my team is on literally right now dealing with eviction issues. And it was just the phase 2 just began yesterday, which allowed notices to begin for tenants who owe arrears or back due rent. And so it's been the last 24 hours has been really just heartbreaking and sad and enraging as we try to save people and get them informed to know what's going on.
Thank you so much for that powerful answer. I mean, I think even with all this money coming from Stay DC, even if everybody who owed rent during the pandemic is able to get assistance from Stay DC, that just puts us back where we were before the pandemic started, right? Which was already a housing crisis. So I do just sort of want to open this up to the other panelists. Even before the pandemic, we had a housing crisis, we had an eviction crisis, we had an affordability crisis here in DC. How does that show up in the work that you do and in your interactions, with clients at Bread for the City, for example? What does that mean for people to be living in a constant state of fear of eviction?
So, Amy, I can go. Especially because of the population that I work with, who are already dealing with some mental instability. I can tell you, from the very beginning, it has affected at least that population, they're watching brand new buildings go up, and watching, places that they're so familiar with or have been all their life just be torn down and replaced with things that they can't even go, to the park, to the new park. It really affects their mental health. And so I have watched consumers over the years be very fearful of what is going to happen next. And are they going to have to leave to go to, some of our clients just up and say, you know what, I'm just going to leave town. I don't even want to see this anymore. And, you'll get a call from somewhere in Wyoming. And the client landed up in Wyoming, but, I do a lot of talking and just listening. And so this is very fearful for people who are already mentally unstable to think that they're going to be phased out of all they've ever known.
And Amy, for being in the housing advocacy department, it's just really heartbreaking that people, can't find homes and affordable places to live. I did outreach yesterday at the Adams shelter over in Northeast, and those people are burning mad because they've been in shelters for so long, and then the mayor bulldozes a tent city, and then she puts the remainder people up in hotels, and the people in shelters are like, what? I guess I should have been in the tent city and got bulldozed too. At least I have a place to live. And, they're really mad, angry, and scared. But I know for me personally, when my health went bad, I couldn't do the work that I used to do. And, your rent gets behind. And, there are like, sometimes things happen to you in life that you have no control over. And you get behind in rent. And just that stress every day, day in and day out, wondering if I'm going to, have a place to live tomorrow, made my health even worse. So that constant being on edge, that constant, I can remember coming home from bread volunteering, and you catch the bus into the neighborhood and you see people's furniture sat out, and my heart would just instantly start racing. I mean, my palms would get sweaty. I would just freak out. And when I got to my stop, I look and see, and oh God, okay, they haven't put me out. And that just really just tears you up. I mean, it eats you up from the inside out, and you get sicker and sicker. And then you can't work at all to make any money. So, like the councilwoman said, housing is health.
Thank you both so much for really bringing that home and making it real about how this impacts members of our community on a daily basis and on a very deep level. I want us to now try to end on a little note of hope, because these are issues Bread for the City has always been working on. These are issues we worked on very hard during the pandemic, and the question of housing justice is something we're continuing to work on. We're all committed to, not just Bread for the City, but everybody here who's here on this call. So I want to give each panelist an opportunity to say what's one thing that you personally can commit to doing to help achieve housing justice in a racially equitable DC in the next year. I'll start with you, Danielle.
Thanks. I was going to ask if you meant me personally or one personally, but the answer is good for both. So, sorry, I really appreciate what Leonard and Robin were saying, and it hits home. So thank you for that. It's one thing to study something and talk about it, and it's another to live it and be willing to talk about it and relive that while you're talking about it. So I have a deep respect for that. Thank you. Oh, sorry, you're on mute if you wanted us to hear you.
Are you talking to me? Well, for me, you know, I am in Bridge for the City's Housing Advocacy Department. And for me, it's my ministry. And, you know, I'm never going to give up. I'm never going to not stop fighting. And just to paraphrase a Bible verse, and I'll be paraphrasing, you know, it says, don't ever stop doing a good thing because in due time, the harvest will come. So we can't give up. We have to continue to fight, and even, get radical with it a little bit. That's where we are right now in this housing shortage and affordable housing shortage. We're going to have to, bring 200 and 300 people into the city council hearings, and we're going to have to protest. We're going to have to get loud, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to help work towards that, build an army of activists and community organizers. That's what I plan on doing this year.
Thank you, Leonard.
So I will answer the question, but I feel like that also we could end right there. So I think it's important to note that DC does a lot of things that are really good in this arena. We have organizations like BRED, we have record investments in the trust fund from the Bowser administration. We have folks like Councilmember Lewis George on the council who are passing really good, important laws that are protecting people and their right to live here. But if we're talking about housing as a human right, if we're talking about housing justice, then I think it's important to look at it not what can we do? Can we keep this program going? Can we fund that program? But to look at what is the need and then meet the need. And I know we can do the math because an undisclosed number of years ago when I was starting out my career at CNHED, we did the math with the district. So it can be done. We can know that number. We can find that money. We can make it happen. So it's both, I think, something to be hopeful about and something to light a fire under all of us. We have to do the work, but it can be done.
Thank you for that. Council member, can I have one commitment of the many things I'm sure you'll be doing in the next year in the name of housing justice?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to add to Mr. Edwards over there is also while you're getting these activists and organizers ready, I need some of y'all to run for office. I stepped over from the organizer side, by myself, and it's power in numbers over here, and so I need some housing justice warriors on this side, and so I want to throw that out there too, because not being selected to be on the housing committee is a structural thing that can be changed. When the housing committee gets reorganized and housing champions get taken off of it, there's a reason behind it. And if we don't get the power on the council and the people on it, we need to do that. So I wanted to digress from that and say that, and hope that inspires somebody on this call to potentially think about running and joining me on this side. Things that individuals can do most immediately, I think, get involved in helping your neighbors apply for Stay DC, programs to help tenants one-on-one with getting through, advocate for eviction and foreclosure moratorium, and budget and oversight season, come and testify and organize and make some real noise. As for me, I am committing to seeing rent control expansion get passed. We have to get this done this year, and by this year I mean this session, so that could be between this year and next year. I made a commitment to it, and I'm not giving up on it, whether I'm on the housing committee or not. There's always a way. Where there's a will, there's a way to get it done, and so I'm committed to seeing rent control expansion get passed. We have to stabilize housing prices and burdens on tenants, and so working to make those things happen, relooking at the TOPA rights, those that were taken away from us, and whether that's something that we can reinstate. and bring back. It's something I was very passionate about when TOPA rights were removed, having been able to avoid displacement a second time by exercising rights that are no longer available. So I'm committed to doing all of those things and continuing to fight every single day on the council to bring the human voice to the decisions that are being made, and to continue to work with partners like Bread for the City to shine light on these issues and to bring some real impact via legislation and organizing.
Incredible. Thank you so much for that. Robin, I'll let you have the final word. Would you like to share with us one thing you're doing in the next year for housing justice? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, I will commit myself to helping consumers who are already have vouchers in place but are living in Tent City become housed. That is real.
Amazing.
That is real. There are vouchers already in place, some of them with their names already on them. And so I will commit to, I have one that I talked to today, and I committed even before I got on this phone that we are going to get her housed with her voucher that has her name on it. And so I will strengthen my commitment today to do everything that I can.
Wow, it's unbelievable that that is a need. That's something that someone actually needs to do, but glad you are the woman for the job. So thank you all so much. I think we have reached the point where we can have a little interaction with the participants, the audience here. So if people want to put their questions into the Q&A, I think then we can share those questions with the panelists, or you can chat. I'm not sure actually what permissions the audience has. But there was a question the council member, which she answered already. There's a few more questions coming in right now. One is maybe more of a comment than a question. It says, how can we address the exploitation of affordable housing policy and subsidies offered through state and federal agencies by private developers? Yes, and this person linked to a recent news article that came out that the DC government had given $82 million that was through the Housing Production Trust Fund that was intended to subsidize the building of affordable housing. And unfortunately, there's not enough oversight to tell if any of that money actually went to actual affordable housing for people who need it. So sort of just the latest in many exposés of the sort that the agencies in DC that are supposed to be providing affordable housing and supposed to be keeping it clean and habitable and healthy have not been. I don't know if anyone on the panel, perhaps even the council member, have ideas of what can be done about this kind of issue.
Well, I can jump in. There's a lot of aspects to that. Some of it is the oversight. There have been laws passed that require extensive reporting that isn't being done. And so that's something that needs to be worked out between the administration and the council. And I know that can be difficult for especially newer members of the council to leverage that stuff. I worked for Councilmember Brianne Nadeau in her first year in office, and being a new office is a lot. So I understand and empathize and respect that. I also want to point out that a lot of the tools that we use to fund affordable housing skew toward upper income. So, if we're looking at 80% of AMI or 60% of AMI, that's much more favorable for lots of types of financing, including tax credits. So if we look at the trust fund as a tool that we want to use to leverage the most dollars, then you'll end up with a lot of 60% AMI tax credit buildings because you leverage the most dollars. And there are reasons that someone would take that approach, but it does not get you to 30% of AMI, which is extremely important. And the trust fund law itself has a requirement that we spend a certain percentage of the trust fund on those households, and we have never done it. So I think that goes back to looking at the whole, you know, being clear about our goals and being clear about whether we're accomplishing them.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. Another question in the chat, oh, there's several. One is, are most DC landlords for your clients individuals or corporations? So I'll take that, since I do work in eviction defense as part of my job in the legal department at Bread for the City. I believe that most of our clients, landlords, are corporations. And there was a study that came out from Georgetown University Public Policy School last year or the year before that we'll make sure to share with all participants in the resource link that we're going to be sending around. Because this was a study specifically about evictions in DC, the racial impacts of evictions, and who are the landlords that are involved in these evictions. And they found that there's 20 companies that were responsible for about half of all eviction filings in 2018. And just to, again, there were 32,000 eviction cases filed in 2018, and half of those were just these same 20 sort of like, what's the word? Usual suspects, I don't know, frequent customers at the DC eviction courts that often use the traumatic and violent court process basically as a rent collection tool. So their system is just to file eviction cases over and over again, which causes, as we've heard, an incredible amount of trauma and stress and mental health issues for the person on the other side of it. And it's the average amount of money that a tenant owes when the landlord files the eviction case is $1,200. So we're talking about people who are maybe a few days behind on 1 month's worth of rent. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop there. There's a few other questions in the chat. So let me.
Amy, I would actually love for you to go on just a little bit longer. I don't think we've hit on the impact of eviction on an individual. It ruins your credit. It ruins your ability to get new housing. It can hurt your chances of getting a job. So I think that's another thing to flag in addition to all these other consequences.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. If your landlord is filing an eviction case against you on a regular basis and you have to take a day off work to go to the courthouse to show up and try to save your housing, you might at the same time lose your job because you've missed a day of work. So it's just part of these many vicious cycles where impoverishing people who are already poor because they don't have the safety net to allow them to juggle all these things at once.
And Amy, if I could just say something on that, you know, when you get that notice, you know, it's just a scary thing. But then when you go down to courthouse, it's big and intimidating, and you're like, you go in and it's like, what am I doing here? I don't want to be here. You're frozen. You really don't know what to do and how to help yourself at that time. And then you see all of these people, and it's a long process. It just wears you out completely. It just really mentally just wears on you to the point you're like a deer in the headlights. You don't know what to do. You're confused.
Yep. Thank you for adding that. Here's a question in the chat about the trend of speculators or just investors generally buying up properties to manage as rentals, but keeping the property underutilized to maintain high rental rates. I have heard something similar, that a lot of these luxury rental apartment buildings are not even fully occupied, and yet they have those very high rents. I don't know if Danielle or Councilmember Lewis George, do you have ideas about how that could be addressed? I'll kick it over to the council member first, because this may go to what you were saying earlier about rent control.
Yeah, I was gonna say rent control is one of it's one of the ways. I think another thing is looking at our DOPA law, District Opportunity to Purchase Act, as well, where we did some income averaging, where we do like income averaging, and that could be a creative approach to take in more places, because averaging requires a balancing of deeply affordable, 30 to 40% or below, with the higher income affordability of 80% or more. So I'm thinking expansion of rent control. I'm thinking DOPA, looking at our District Opportunity to Purchase Act. Sorry, trying not to use acronyms because housing has tons of those. You know, I think those are the two ways I'm looking at it. The recent Airbnb law tried to get at some speculation buying, but we need time for that to get enforced.
Thank you. Yeah, none of these are super easy fixes, but it is good to know that there are answers out there if we have the political will. There was a question in the Q&A that I just want to make sure that other folks have heard the answer to, about whether there's anything that DC residents can do to influence the makeup of the DC Council's housing committee. What would you suggest, anyone?
Sure. So there's a process at the beginning of each council session where the chairman sets out the rules, and that includes what the committees are and who is on each committee. So like everything with legislation, the best time to get a bug in someone's ear is before the legislation comes out. But then once it does, if it doesn't look the way you want it to, you really only have a couple days to get really loud about it, because they vote on that at the first session. So it's a tough one, but I think, you know, just preparing for that. So going into a new session, I mean, the new session will happen at the same time, like, I mean, even during COVID, kind of like the sun will rise. It happens at the same time. So you can get geared up a few weeks before that and start putting a bug in the chairman's ear.
Yeah, I would say there's never been a public advocacy campaign on committee markups, but maybe that's something that could be changed. Advocates should be more outspoken and maybe organize on this for it. It is a matter of changing the rules, and everybody has to be on board. I mean, if we as a majority council decide to change the rules, we can do that. The only other option is changing the chairman. So those are your two options there. That's all I'll say.
She said it. I didn't say it.
While we're talking about things people can do, I did want to make a little plug that there is a really amazing canvassing operation underway. There are volunteers all over DC who have been knocking on the doors of people whose homes are scheduled for eviction. This category of people are all people whose landlord filed an eviction case against them before the pandemic, and that case was mostly put on hold. The landlord was not able to actually evict them until about a month ago. Evictions resumed, and there has been a really amazing collaboration between organizers and volunteers and legal service attorneys all across DC to identify where are those people that are actually have an eviction date scheduled. The U.S. Marshals knows when they're planning to show up to change the locks and get volunteers to the door ahead of time to let people know. And it's incredible. Some people didn't even know that they were scheduled for an eviction because they never got the mail. They couldn't read the mail. They didn't understand the mail. They were too overwhelmed by the many compounding, stressful, traumatic situations going on over the last year and a half. And
that's literally, yep, that's literally what's happening right now. So my team is literally on site. Marshals came and we were like, this is a no. So literally, that's why I was like, it's real. It's happening. Marshals are showing up and people are not aware.
Yeah. And the good news is that in about, I can't even remember how many, but I think it's like half of the doors we knock, volunteers have been knocking on, they've been able to prevent those evictions. Yep. Because there are these resources available, such as Stay DC that several of our panelists have referenced. It's not everybody's situation can be resolved with Stay DC, but we are connecting those tenants in need to free housing attorneys who have some tricks up our sleeves of different ways that we can try to prevent evictions. So if anybody who's listening wants to become one of those volunteers and do some of the most satisfying canvassing out there, there's going to be a training this Saturday in Meridian Hill Park, also known as Malcolm X Park. And we'll make sure that the flyer with the information about the training gets shared in the resources that are going to be shared. And I see that Molly also just put the link right into the chat. But yeah, if anyone has ever done like door knocking for other causes, this is like the most gratifying door knocking, because you are offering somebody something so huge, which is the relief of being able to possibly avoid an eviction. So I wanted to plug that. And I think we are unfortunately actually now coming to an end. So I am going to turn things over to my colleague, Ashley Dom, who's going to leave us with some closing remarks. It's been really a pleasure having this conversation with you all.
Thanks, Amy. I'm here, but the Zoom is telling me that I cannot create my video because the host has to create my video. So we are now seeing all the technical problems that I run into on a daily basis. Here we go. Hi. Well, thank you, Amy, so much for turning it over. I would also like to thank all of our panelists. Thanks, Amy, for moderating. I really appreciate you all taking time out of your day, out of your afternoon, to come and have this really important conversation. I want to thank everyone for attending as well. All of our supportive audience members, all those great questions. You know, our panelists have each committed to doing something active around this issue. I thought that was really motivating and really inspiring. And I would charge all of us here listening to this conversation and being part of this conversation to also leave thinking about that same mandate. You know, this is an issue a lot of people care about, but what does it mean to be actively involved in solving issues like this? What does it mean to take part? What's a small part that each of us could take walking away from this conversation today? The work we do at Bread for the City is possible because of you all, because of everyone who's attending this conversation today, our audience members, our staff like Robin, Leonard, and Amy, folks out in the community like Danielle and council person Louis George. But it's also possible because of our client leadership, clients like Leonard. And so Leonard, I really thank you for coming today and sharing your perspective with this group. I want to close by just thanking everyone for their support. We can do this work because we have such a supportive community, because we have folks like all of you who have attended today who understand our work, support our work, understand why folks like us are out in the community doing this work. We do have an opportunity for folks to continue to support us, specifically our work in this space. I think Molly has put in the chat how people can support the work of our legal clinic. Our legal clinic has a housing law program and works tirelessly on these issues. Apparently, we also can text Housing DC to 707070, which is the first time I've gotten to say something like that, which is really exciting. You know, as you saw this afternoon, we're continuing to do this work because the work isn't going away. There's an increased need across our city. But, you know, I really appreciated that this group ended on such a positive note, really thinking about, you know, what each of us could do in this space. And you know, the positivity that comes out of organizing around this issue and seeing just countless numbers of folks rising up and organizing around this issue is really heartening and really inspiring. So thank you all for, again, taking time out of your day, hanging out with Bread for the City for an hour this afternoon. Maybe you had a little coffee break with us, which is great. Thank you to our staff that put this event on. And again, each of these panelists, so amazing, so great to hear from each of you, and Amy for moderating as well.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, everybody have a great rest of your afternoon.